On my 70th birthday, my daughter-in-law planted drugs in my room. My son stood by while the police dragged me out of the house I paid off. He didn't blink. That night, I stopped being a mother. I became a target. For 2 days, I sat in a cold cell while they filed for control over my retirement fund. $6.1 million. But they forgot one thing. I had prepared for betrayal, and the trap they set was already wired to collapse. I was standing by the kitchen counter, folding napkins for my own birthday dinner, when the doorbell rang. Brooke was the one who answered. She always had a way of taking over the house like it was hers. A moment later, 2 officers stepped into the foyer. They asked for me by name and said they had a warrant to search my room. I didn't argue. I just stepped aside. Zach came down the stairs slowly. He didn't ask what was going on. He didn't even meet my eyes. The search didn't last long. One of the officers reached under the throw pillow on my bed and pulled out a clear plastic bag. Drugs. I heard Brooke gasp like she was shocked. Her hand flew to her mouth so perfectly I could almost admire the performance. Zach looked straight ahead. He didn't flinch, didn't say a word. I looked at him then, not as a mother, just as a woman trying to understand the man she raised. They handcuffed me in front of my son, in front of his wife, in my own home. At the station, everything was cold. The light, the chair, the voices. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I had just turned 70. I had been cooking dinner for my own birthday, and they let me sit in a jail cell for 2 nights without bail. No one called. No one came. The charge was possession with intent. They had pictures, reports, statements. Brooke had even submitted a written concern weeks before, saying I had been acting strange, paranoid, unstable. It looked official. The only thing that wasn't written down was the truth. This wasn't about drugs. It was about control. About a $6.1 million retirement account that had been sitting in a fund Zach and Brooke thought they could access the moment I was declared unfit. They weren't trying to ruin my life. They were trying to replace it. I remember sitting on the edge of the cot that second night, staring at the scuffed concrete floor and thinking, so this is how it happens. Not with a bang, not with some dramatic betrayal, but in silence. In forms filed, stories crafted, little traps placed under pillows. You spend your whole life building something, a home, a family, trust. And in a single weekend, you find yourself erased. But I wasn't done. They thought they had the upper hand. They didn't know what I still had. To anyone listening who has ever been betrayed quietly, gently by the people who said they loved you, I hope you stay with me. This isn't the end of the story. Not for me. And maybe not for you either. When I stepped out of the station 2 days later, the sun was bright, almost offensive. I held a plastic bag with my wallet, house keys, and reading glasses. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the cold echo of betrayal still crawling under my skin. No one came to pick me up, not even a message. I took the bus home. My legs ached. My pride ached more. The house was quiet when I got back, like it didn't even recognize me anymore. Brooke was gone, but Zach was in the backyard, pretending to trim hedges. He didn't look up. I didn't call his name. I walked straight into my room. The bed was made, the pillow placed neatly back in position like nothing had happened. The rug had been vacuumed, too clean. I stood in the doorway, feeling like a guest in my own life. Later that evening, Zach knocked once and stepped in. No apology, no eye contact. He said the charges had been dropped, but warned me to be more careful moving forward. Careful, he said. as if I had slipped something into my own pillow. He handed me a folder. It held documents I didn't recognize. Financial ones, account authorizations, care agreements, medical directives. He said he had taken the liberty to organize things, just in case I ever found myself in trouble again. His voice was flat, calculated, almost kind. I didn't say anything. I flipped through the papers slowly, pretending to read them, but I was watching him, watching the way he stood, relaxed, assuming I would fold the way I always had. He told me Brooke had written everything down for my protection, that if anything ever happened again, they'd be ready to step in, just to help, just until I was stable. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about the drugs. It wasn't even about getting me arrested. That was only step one. The real plan was long-term. Brooke and Zach had decided I was going to disappear, quietly, legally, one signature at a time. The house was in my name. The retirement accounts, too. There were stocks, a pension, and a contract I had signed with a federal agency that still paid out quarterly. I had always kept things private, even from Zach, but now they had found a way in. I set the folder down, thanked him, said I needed rest. He smiled and told me to take my time. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark and made a list, not of revenge, of clarity, of everything I had left, everything still in my name, every document I had ever signed, and what I would do with them now. In the morning, I walked into the garage and unlocked the old metal cabinet in the corner. It hadn't been touched in years. Inside, everything was still there. My husband's files, my original will, my contracts. A folder marked backup. I opened it. There, tucked behind the old estate papers, was something I had nearly forgotten about. A second power of attorney document, unactivated, signed years ago with a clause tied to mental capacity. And the name on it wasn't Zach. It was Dylan, my nephew. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered his laugh when he was little, how he used to sit on the counter while I cooked. He was working for a logistics firm now. Smart, steady, trusted. I hadn't talked to him in almost 2 years, but I had named him for a reason. I folded the paper, placed it in my bag, and locked the cabinet again. Something inside me clicked into place. They wanted me erased, but they were about to remember who I was. The next morning, I got dressed early and took the long way to the bank. Not because I had to, but because I needed time to clear my mind. There's something about the sound of your own footsteps on an empty sidewalk that reminds you you're still here, still real, still solid. At the bank, I met with Mrs. Langston. She'd been managing my retirement accounts since before Zach graduated high school. She greeted me with that familiar half-smile and asked if everything was all right. I told her I wanted to review my beneficiary structure. That was all. Inside her office, I handed her a sheet of names. Old names. Family members I hadn't spoken to in years, friends from my church group, and 2 former students who had stayed in touch since I left teaching. I removed Zach. I removed Brooke. I removed any trace of what had once been my plan for legacy. I asked her to flag any suspicious activity moving forward. Silent alarms, internal reports. She looked at me for a moment longer than usual, but nodded. She understood without asking. Next, I walked 2 blocks to a small legal firm tucked between a dry cleaner and a tailor. Inside, everything smelled like printer ink and lemon polish. The lawyer, Mr. McElroy, had once helped me settle a licensing dispute over one of my educational programs. He remembered me. I showed him the folder from my garage, including the unactivated power of attorney. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He asked if I was planning to invoke it, I told him not yet. I just wanted it reviewed, updated, and prepared. Quietly. No notifications, no alerts. We spent an hour revising the language, tightening the clauses, and placing specific limitations on who could access what. I left with a fresh copy in my bag and a smaller one locked in a fireproof envelope in his safe. By the time I got home, the house felt different. Brooke had returned. I could hear her in the kitchen, her voice bright and overly polite. She had baked something. Peach cobbler, I think. She offered me a slice like nothing had happened, like I hadn't spent 2 nights on a concrete cot while she watered my plants and folded my laundry. I accepted it, sat down at the table, ate every bite. After dinner, I returned to my room and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was a black GoPro camera I had used during the pandemic to film educational videos for seniors. It was still functional. I charged it overnight. For the next week, I kept it running quietly from a corner shelf behind my books. It wasn't illegal. It was my room, my equipment. The lens was small. The room was small. And people tend to forget what's watching when they stop pretending. On Thursday, Brooke stepped into my room while I was in the garden. I saw her through the front window. Calm. Quick. She moved the pillow, reached beneath the mattress, opened my closet. She wasn't looking for anything. She was checking, rehearsing. The next day, Zach brought home a set of papers, said they were just for review. Living trust proposals, emergency guardianship language, all wrapped in gentle tones and concerned glances. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I asked for time to read them. Then, that night, I slipped the camera from the shelf, uploaded the files, and named them by date. Everything labeled, everything stored. This wasn't just about my money anymore. It was about the space I had given people who never truly saw me, who only loved me when I was useful, who smiled while planning my exit. But they forgot. I taught for 32 years. I saw cheaters every semester, and I never once flinched when I caught one in the act. Now it was my turn to grade, and the red pen was back in my hand. I spent the weekend reviewing every document Zach had slipped into that folder. The legal language was just careful enough to look harmless, but between the lines, it gave him broad access to my finances and my care decisions. One form, disguised as a standard medical release, would allow him to move me into a care facility without a second opinion. Another authorized him to act as my financial guardian in the event of cognitive decline, a term conveniently left undefined. They thought I would sign it out of confusion, or fear, or worse, the kind of blind trust I used to have. On Monday, I drove to a small notary office on the east side of town and had 2 forms stamped and witnessed. One revoked any previous powers of attorney. The other designated Dylan as my sole financial and medical contact, should anything happen. I filed copies at my lawyer's office and kept the originals in a safety box under my bed. By Wednesday, Brooke was chirping again. She said she had found a lovely retirement community she wanted me to visit. She claimed it was just for fun, something she had seen in a magazine. The brochure she left on my nightstand was glossy, full of staged smiles and yoga classes. I slipped it into the trash as soon as she left the room. That afternoon, I placed another call, this one to my former student, Hazel. She now worked as a freelance analyst for an asset tracing firm. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but she picked up on the second ring and called me Mrs. Linton like it was still 1998. I told her I needed a discreet favor. Nothing official, just a set of eyes on a few accounts I suspected had been accessed improperly. She agreed without hesitation. By Friday, I had everything I needed. Video files labeled and sorted, a list of names removed from every account. Digital backups uploaded to an encrypted cloud drive Dylan had helped me set up years ago. Every door they thought was open was now locked from the inside. That evening, Brooke brought over a casserole and sat beside me on the couch. She said she had been thinking about my future, that she and Zach wanted to make sure I was safe, cared for, not overwhelmed by all the paperwork and finances at my age. She smiled with her eyes first, then her mouth. I watched her closely. Her confidence had grown. She believed the plan was working. So I played along. I told her I appreciated the thought, that maybe it was time for me to start letting go of some things, simplifying. She touched my hand lightly and said that was all they ever wanted. Support, peace, family harmony. The next morning, Hazel sent me an encrypted email. There had been login attempts on 2 of my accounts, both from devices linked to Zach's home network. Both failed. I forwarded the details to McElroy. He replied within an hour and told me not to respond to anything they sent me directly. From now on, he would be the point of contact for all legal and financial matters. His tone was calm, but beneath the words, I could feel the urgency. I stood in the kitchen later that night, washing a single cup in the sink. The house was still. Brooke and Zach were out. I stared at the window over the sink and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was focused. Every trap they had laid, every quiet manipulation, had pushed me to rebuild the boundaries I had let slip for years. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to clarity. Not power, not revenge, just the quiet knowledge that I wasn't alone in the game they had started. They had made their move. Now it was my turn to respond. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with precision, with control, and the timing would be mine. On Sunday morning, the air was thick with a strange quiet. Brooke was already in the garden pruning roses she never planted, wearing that crisp linen apron like she owned the soil. Zach sat in the dining room with his laptop open, pretending to review spreadsheets, though I knew he hadn't worked since last April. I moved through the house like a guest, careful not to disturb their delicate balance of illusion. I spent the afternoon in my sunroom, sorting through paper files. Not digital copies, not emails. Real printed statements and deeds and contracts. Things that had weight and signature and memory. I held each page as if it were a piece of my history, which in many ways it was. That's when I found it. A property title from 1987, a parcel of land I had forgotten I still owned. Back then, it was meant as a summer project, just an acre and a half near Oakhurst, nothing fancy, but fully paid off and still in my name. No liens, no co-signers, just me. It felt like a door I hadn't realized was still unlocked. I drove out to see it the next day. The old cabin was still there, worn but upright, the roof slightly caved on one side, windows dirty but unbroken. The land was overgrown, but there was something peaceful about the wildness. It hadn't been touched by any of the people who now filled my life with tension. No Brooke, no Zach, just air and trees and the faint rustle of something that hadn't been ruined yet. I stood on that porch and realized I needed a place like this. Not forever, just for now, a space that was mine again. When I returned home, Brooke was on the phone, pacing the kitchen, voice low and firm. I caught a few words. Something about timeline, something about transfer. She didn't see me. That night, I made my decision. I contacted Hazel and asked her to arrange a secure sale of a small mutual fund I had kept under a different name. She handled everything. Discreet, clean. By Wednesday, the funds had cleared. I placed a down payment on repairs for the cabin and arranged for a local contractor to start work within the month. I told no one. In the meantime, I kept the house peaceful. I cooked dinner, I folded laundry, I even complimented Brooke's choice in drapery, which made her pause just long enough to wonder if she had finally worn me down. But she hadn't. That Friday, McElroy called. The login attempts had continued. Zach had now tried from 3 separate IP addresses, escalating in frequency. McElroy had flagged the activity with the bank's fraud department, quietly. Nothing official yet. But it was no longer a suspicion. It was evidence. I asked McElroy to proceed with the contingency plan we had discussed. He agreed. That night, I walked past Zach in the hallway. He didn't look up, just mumbled something about meetings. Brooke was in the living room with her tablet, smiling at something on the screen. She looked up as I passed and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I returned it, because that's what they understood. Smiles, calm, politeness. But under that, things were shifting. The cabin was real, the accounts were locked, the legal protections were in place. And every day they thought I was slipping, I was building. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't want a scene. What I wanted was clarity, safety, autonomy. And step by step, I was reclaiming it, quietly, carefully. They wouldn't see it coming, because they had stopped seeing me a long time ago. I left early that Saturday morning, telling Zach I had a doctor's appointment across town. He didn't look up from his phone. Brooke gave a half smile, barely registering my presence. Their indifference had become routine, but for me, it was a shield. As long as they didn't see me coming, I could move freely. But I wasn't heading to any doctor. I drove straight to the cabin in Oakhurst. The place looked even better than I remembered. The new windows gleamed in the morning light. The roof had been replaced with cedar shingles, and the porch steps were freshly sanded. Inside, the contractors were busy installing new wiring. The air smelled like sawdust and promise. I stood in the doorway and closed my eyes. No voices, no pressure, no manipulation, just space. Mine. A young electrician offered me a cup of coffee. We sat for a few quiet minutes on the edge of the porch. No questions. Just 2 people who didn't owe each other anything. For the first time in months, I felt like I was breathing clean air. On the way home, I stopped by McElroy's office to sign the next set of documents. One was a formal letter granting him full legal authority to act on my behalf in any dispute with Zach or Brooke. The second was a supplemental will, this one removing both their names from every possible inheritance and redirecting those funds to causes I actually believed in. I walked out of that office lighter. That evening, dinner was quiet. Brooke recited updates about her Pilates class, a brunch invitation, a new neighbor she found charming. Zach barely touched his food. I stayed quiet, nodding here and there, eating slowly. To them, I was just tired, maybe fading. That night, in my room, I checked the footage. More of the same. Zach going through my desk drawers, phone in hand. Brooke opening the safe cabinet in the study, snapping photos of old documents she probably didn't even understand. I uploaded the clips to Hazel's cloud and backed them up to an external drive in my purse. One by one, these files were becoming a map of intent. On Sunday morning, I received a message from Hazel. 2 of my older Keystone accounts had been flagged. Unauthorized login attempts from a device registered under Brooke's marketing agency. That was the 3rd attempt in 10 days. Hazel had already frozen those accounts temporarily. No damage done. But this time, she forwarded the full report directly to McElroy. Things weren't just suspicious anymore. They were criminal. I packed a small suitcase that afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just the things that mattered. My late husband's old watch, a photo of Dylan on his 10th birthday, a a small leather-bound journal with important dates and phone numbers. I zipped the case quietly and placed it in the back seat of my car. That evening, Zach asked if I had a minute to talk. His voice was polite, a little too careful. Brooke hovered nearby, pretending to scroll through her phone. He handed me a new version of the power of attorney, said the last one had errors, that they wanted to make sure everything was properly taken care of. I looked him in the eye and smiled. I told him I'd think about it. And I did. For about 3 seconds. Then I slipped the papers into a folder, filed them under attempted theft, and sent a digital copy to McElroy and Hazel. The line had been crossed. No more patience, no more pretending. They were still playing a quiet game of manipulation, but I had already left the table. They just didn't know it yet. The morning after Zach handed me those forged documents, I woke up before dawn. I had barely slept, but I wasn't tired. I was focused. My hands moved without hesitation as I made coffee, packed a cooler with some fruit and sandwiches, and placed it in the car next to my small suitcase. The cabin was waiting, and now it was ready. I didn't say goodbye. I left the note where I knew they wouldn't see it until dinner. Just 4 words. I need some air. By the time they read it, I was 2 hours away, driving toward the one place untouched by their schemes. The cabin felt different now. Lived in. Real. The new locks were installed. Hazel had arranged for a landline, no digital trace. A local contractor had dropped off firewood, and McElroy had already sent copies of all legal protections to my safe here. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for someone to knock on my door. I was deciding who would get to stand on my porch. I unpacked my things slowly, not because there was much, but because each item I placed felt like a declaration. This is mine. This space. This breath. This moment. Later that afternoon, I drove into the nearest town and opened a new P.O. box. Then I stopped at a second bank and opened a separate trust account. This one wasn't tied to any of my old information. Hazel had created a clean identity trail using my maiden name. Everything was layered now, shielded. Back at the cabin, I lit a small fire and sat in the old rocking chair facing the woods. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things I'd pushed aside to make room for Zach's needs, Brooke's moods, their plans, their comfort. I remembered how, when Zach was a child, he used to sit on the floor beside me while I read. He'd lean his head against my knee and hum softly. I used to think that kind of closeness never disappears, that somehow, deep down, the person you raise will always remember the warmth. But warmth, I've learned, can be forgotten, especially when someone else promises them more. The next morning, I called Hazel. I asked her to move forward with the final stage. That included transferring all remaining assets into a protected trust, one that excluded Zach and Brooke entirely. Hazel didn't ask why. She just said, "It's already in motion." Then came the letter. Zach had mailed it to my old house. Hazel intercepted it. In it, he said they were worried, that they hadn't heard from me, that they wanted to make sure I was okay. And tucked inside, another copy of the power of attorney. This one had Brooke's handwriting on the envelope. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Hazel advised we initiate the quiet notification clause in my estate file. That meant McElroy would send a letter, formally stating that I had reassigned all legal control to new representation and that any future communication must go through him. I approved it. That night, I slept without locking the door, not because I was careless, but because no one knew where I was. Zach and Brooke were still spinning their web, but they didn't realize the spider had moved. They were chasing a version of me that no longer existed. The woman who had waited, trusted, made excuses. She was gone. and the one who remained had nothing left to lose, only something to reclaim. I spent the next week in the cabin without checking my phone, not even once. The stillness wrapped around me like a weighted blanket. I cooked simple meals, cleaned corners no one had touched in years, and let myself breathe without an audience. No more questions, no expectations, no eyes tracking my every move. Then, late Friday afternoon, McElroy's assistant sent word through Hazel. A certified letter from Zach had arrived at the law office. It was a request for emergency access to my medical information. He claimed I had gone missing. He insisted I was mentally unwell, and he attached a statement from Brooke, saying I had recently become paranoid and possibly delusional. They were escalating. Hazel's voice on the line was firm but calm. She said this was expected. She had already preemptively filed my voluntary psychological evaluation from 3 months ago. Clean bill of health, independent physician, undisputed credentials. Their attempt to discredit me failed before it even reached court. But I still felt something heavy inside. Not fear, not regret. A quiet grief. That my own son would weaponize my love, twist my absence into proof of madness. That Brooke, who once called me her second mother, could put her name to such a lie. But this was the cost of truth, and I had already paid the deposit. The next morning I dressed with intention. Slacks, a navy blouse, pearl earrings I hadn't worn in years. I drove to the notary's office and had my presence recorded on video, stating clearly that I was of sound mind and fully capable of managing my own estate. Then I walked into the county courthouse with Hazel. She filed for a formal protective order, not just physical, but financial. It would block any future power of attorney or conservatorship requests unless initiated by me, in person, before a judge. Zach and Brooke weren't trying to take care of me. They were trying to take over me. And I had cut the wires before the trap closed. That same afternoon, I returned to the cabin and found an envelope slipped under the screen door. No address. No, just my name. Inside was a handwritten letter from Dylan. He had heard from one of Brooke's friends that I had gone off the grid. He said he didn't believe the stories being told. He missed me, and he wanted to see me if I was safe. I read the letter 3 times. My hands trembled, not from fear, from something deeper. Hope. Dylan was Brooke's stepson, not mine by blood. But I had held him when he had night terrors. I had helped him write college essays. We planted tomatoes together every spring. And now he was reaching back. He had seen through the fog. That evening, I sat on the porch and wrote him back, short and steady. Told him I was safe, that I was not gone, only reclaiming space. And if he wanted to see me, he'd have to come without noise, without lies. I left it at the general store in town. The clerk promised to deliver it the next time Dylan came through. I watched the sun drop behind the trees, my tea cooling in my hands. Zach and Brooke were scrambling now. I could feel it. They had moved so fast, convinced of my weakness. But now, every door they knocked on was closed, every strategy blocked. And for the first time in this twisted game, they didn't know what I would do next. Because finally, neither did I. And that meant I had choices again. Real ones. Not the kind they handed me with strings attached, but the kind I carved out with silence, strategy, and patience. I arrived back in the city on a Wednesday afternoon. It was cloudy and cold, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier than it should. I parked a few blocks away from Zach and Brooke's house, not because I was hiding, but because I needed the walk. I needed those few minutes to remind myself of who I had become. I wore my grey wool coat, the one I always saved for court dates or funerals. Today felt like both. McElroy was already waiting for me when I got to the restaurant. He had booked a private room at a quiet Italian place Zack loved. The irony didn't escape either of us. At 5 sharp, Zack and Brooke walked in. They looked surprised to see me. Brooke gave me that polished smile she used when she was trying to look innocent. Zack didn't smile at all. He opened with small talk, something about a car lease and traffic. I didn't respond. I just looked at McElroy, and he nodded. He pulled out the first folder. This is a formal declaration that all of Mrs. Morley's assets, including the house, cabin, and remaining financial accounts, are now held in an irrevocable charitable trust, he said. No member of her family, unless named explicitly, will have access or rights to any portion of the estate. Brooke blinked. Zack's hands clenched around his water glass. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Brooke said. McElroy turned to me. I shook my head. No misunderstanding, I said quietly. Just overdue clarity. Then came the second folder. Legal evidence of the forged documents. Copies of the surveillance footage from my study. The timestamps. Brooke entering with gloves. Zack removing files. Brooke returning alone with a set of keys. I could hear their breath shift. Quick, sharp. Zack tried to speak, but McElroy raised a hand. There will be no charges pressed, he said. This isn't about revenge. It's about prevention. Brooke's face turned pale. Zack looked like he'd been slapped. Then McElroy placed the third folder on the table. It was a copy of the new legacy plan. The trust beneficiaries listed weren't names they recognized. They weren't family. They were strangers. Women over 60, women who had lost homes, pensions, security, women who reminded me of me. Brooke's voice finally cracked. You're cutting your own son out. I met her eyes and didn't flinch. I'm cutting out rot, I said. The tree will still grow. Zack didn't say a word. His jaw locked. He looked smaller than I remembered. I stood up. My coat was still buttoned, my hands calm. McElroy gathered the papers and thanked them for coming. No yelling, no scene, just facts. Outside, I walked into the cold air and let it hit my skin. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. My body was steady in a way I hadn't felt in years. Back at the cabin that night, I lit the fireplace and poured a cup of tea. I sat with the silence, not because I was lonely, but because it was mine. They had come expecting to win, to smooth things over, to manipulate. But I hadn't come to discuss. I had come to declare. And in that quiet Italian restaurant, with their world cracking beneath them, they finally realized. The version of me they thought they could bend was gone, and what stood before them was something they had no power over anymore. The morning after that meeting, I stood on the porch of the cabin and listened to the stillness. It wasn't the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of completion, of knowing I had said what needed to be said, of watching the last thread snap between me and the illusion I had clung to for too long. Zack and Brooke had nothing left to argue with. No access, no leverage, no legal foothold. The trust was sealed, the financial protections airtight. McElroy had walked me through every detail again the night before, just to be sure. Everything was locked down. But the strangest part was, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. It was like shedding a heavy coat after a storm. Cold still lingered in the air, but I could feel my own warmth underneath. I spent the day going through old boxes, not the kind filled with papers and accounts, but the kind I hadn't opened in years. Dylan's drawings from middle school, letters from my sister before her cancer took her, birthday cards from neighbours long past. I kept what mattered, burned the rest. That evening, a soft knock came at the cabin door. For a second, I froze. I hadn't told anyone I was here besides Hazel and McElroy. When I opened it, Dylan stood there. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders broader, his eyes quieter. He didn't say anything, just held out a small bag. Groceries, a loaf of bread, coffee, cheese, apples. I stepped aside. He walked in. We sat at the small table by the window, steam rising from 2 mugs of tea. For a while we didn't speak, just listened to the fire crackling in the corner. Then slowly he started talking. He told me he had left Brooke and Zach's house 2 weeks ago, said the lies had started to wear thin, that even Brooke's charm couldn't cover the cracks anymore. He had heard pieces of what happened from Hazel and had gone quiet, trying to sort through his own feelings. But when he saw Brooke packing for another legal strategy session, he realized she still thought she could fix this. Not us, the money. He looked at me then, said he knew what they had done, that he didn't know how to make it right, but he didn't want to be part of it anymore. I told him I didn't need him to fix anything. I just needed to sit across from someone who remembered who I used to be. Before all this, before the betrayal. We talked late into the night, about nothing and everything, about how the garden used to flood every spring, about how Zach cried when he lost his first dog, about how quiet it had gotten in that house after Brooke moved in, like all the air had been pressed out. When he left, he didn't ask for anything, not forgiveness, not a second chance, just time. And for the first time in months, I felt something stir. A thread not tied to grief or duty or defense, a thread of trust. Fragile, yes, but real. That night, I added a name to the trust. Not because I owed him, but because something in me wanted to believe that not all things broken stay broken. Some rebuild themselves quietly, without ceremony, without demand. And maybe that was enough. The week that followed felt like I was living inside a quiet kind of freedom. No footsteps echoing in the hallway, no tension humming in the walls. I woke early, made my coffee, sat with a pen in my hand, and no urgency to defend myself. The trust had been finalized, every clause reviewed, every document sealed. For the first time in years, my assets weren't hanging over my head like bait. They had purpose now, direction. I wasn't just protecting them from Zach and Brooke, I was releasing them from the story they had been trapped in. Hazel came by with a box of mail she had collected for me. Among the envelopes was one marked from the state board. I opened it carefully. Inside was a simple confirmation. The program for women over 60 had received its initial approval. I had spent the past 3 months working with McElroy and a woman named Connie from the Legal Aid Office to design it. A grant system for women like me, women who had been discarded, who had built everything and then been shut out of it. We called it Second Foundation. It wasn't flashy, no gala, no press, but it was real. That same afternoon, Dylan called. He asked if I wanted to join him for a walk through the park near the river. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I still didn't know how to be around him without remembering what he didn't say when it mattered most. But I said yes. He brought coffee and a scarf I had left in his truck years ago. The air was crisp, the leaves beginning to turn. He walked slowly beside me, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. We didn't talk much, and that was fine. What struck me was the way he noticed things now. A squirrel darting under a bench, the way a mother balanced her toddler on her hip while tying her shoe. He was paying attention, really paying attention. At one point, he stopped and looked at the river. Then he turned to me and said something simple. "I see it now." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. I nodded and kept walking. Later that evening, As I sat alone again in the cabin, I found myself smiling, not because anything grand had happened, but because I had finally reached a place where small things felt like enough. No court battles, no letters, no shouting, just the quiet knowing that the damage had been acknowledged, that I had chosen to stop bleeding for people who never noticed the wound. There was still pain. Of course there was. But it wasn't sharp anymore. It was softened by clarity. And somewhere in that softness, I could feel the first sense of peace begin to take root. Not the peace that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. And for a woman who had been pushed aside, betrayed, manipulated, and then left to clean up the mess in silence, that kind of peace was more than I ever expected. It was enough. Spring arrived quietly, the kind of spring that doesn't announce itself with a bang, but with soft winds and slow green. I watched the first blossoms open outside my cabin window and realized it had been almost a year since the night the police walked through my front door. I still think about that moment sometimes, not with rage, not with bitterness, just as a marker, a place in time where something ended and something else began. The trust remains untouched, except for the scholarships already granted. 3 women, all over 60, are enrolled in programs across the state this fall. One is training in home health care, one is studying bookkeeping. The last one just wanted to learn how to use a computer so she could apply for jobs again without asking her grandson for help. That one made me cry, quietly in my kitchen. Zach and Brooke left the city, or maybe they just vanished into it. I heard they sold their place, cashed out what little they could still claim. McElroy had warned me they might try to stir up trouble again, but so far, nothing. I think they finally understood they were no longer in the center of my story, and that was the real shift. For most of my life, I had loved people with the hope that they would love me the same way back. When they didn't, I bent myself. Softer voice, fewer questions, more patience. But peace didn't come from being smaller. It came from saying enough, from choosing to honor what I had built and what I still carried. Not for approval, not for recognition, just because it mattered to me. I still see Dylan, not often, but enough. We walk. We eat grilled cheese sandwiches. Sometimes we talk about his childhood like it belonged to someone else. I think he's trying to forgive himself. I don't rush him. Some repairs take time. As for me, I'm working on a small memoir, nothing grand, just stories, things I've carried, things I've learned. I write a little each morning, just enough to keep the truth company. And some days, I sit on the porch with a blanket on my knees, and I let the quiet settle around me like it always should have. Because the greatest act of reclaiming, I've learned, is not revenge or even justice. It's rest. It's choosing to live gently in a world that once demanded your silence. And so I rest, with a steady heart, and a life that finally, quietly belongs to me. If you've ever felt discarded or doubted your own worth after betrayal, I hope this story stayed with you. Maybe it mirrored something in your past. Maybe it gave you a glimpse of peace ahead. If any part of this touched you, I'd love to know how. Share a memory, a moment, or simply how you're finding your way back to yourself. We're not alone in these stories, and your voice matters here.